Hello and welcome to a brand new show on Wavering Thinking called Lakeside Reflections that I'll be doing with Garrett, who has been joining us for some of our mountainside thoughts on Wavering Thinking. So today we're going to be introing our new show of Lakeside Reflections. And we're going to start in Mark chapter 6 and verses 45 through 52. I'll read it and we'll get right into our conversation today. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So Garrett, as we look at this, what are some reflections we can get as we see this section?
Well, I think in this passage, context is kind of important. So if we look back to what happened right before this, Jesus had fed the 5,000 in the presence of his apostles. And after he told them, you give them something to eat. So they were, intimately involved in this miracle with Jesus. And then you see this episode, and it's like they flushed it right out of their brains. So, we can relate to that in our walk, right? We go through seasons of our faith just being a steamroller, and we're seeing blessings, and we're walking with Christ, and then for whatever reason something doesn't go our way, and we tend to just sort of forget the promises that we should be more focused on.
Absolutely. This past week I was challenging my Bible study on Genesis, and we were going through the story of Abraham, and I was pointing out just the incredible points that we sometimes pass over, and one of them was this whole idea of flushing things right out of the brain and totally forgetting the promises of God. And we see, I was pointing out in Genesis chapter 15 where Abraham, he's reminded of the promises of God, and it says that his faith was credited to him as righteousness. And then in the next chapter, he immediately goes and tries to make it happen himself. He forgets everything God's promised and just does it himself. And I think that's the same thing, like you're saying here in Mark chapter 6, where we have this incredible miracle of Jesus feeding the 5,000. The disciples probably were at a huge spiritual level at this point. It was a great mountaintop experience. And then here they are in the middle of the lake, and they totally forget what God has done, and they are afraid. And Jesus has to calm their fear. And when we see that multiple times with the disciples, and how often we do the same thing, as you pointed out, we're in the same boat. We totally forget what God's done for us in the past, and then we just take it to the side, and we totally are forgetting all the promises that God has made us, that he's going to take care of us and lead us and comfort us. So I think that's definitely worth seeing here. What else in this section stands out to you?
Well, I think if we go back even a little bit further in Mark, the end of chapter 4, this is familiar to another boat ride the disciples were on when Jesus was actually in the boat with them, granted, but it's striking the similarities between these. And the thing that I take from it is that we have to be careful in storms and in struggles. That's what's similar between these stories. The first one in the end of chapter 4, when Jesus was in the boat with them, it was in the middle of a terrible storm, right? And the Sea of Galilee was known for like these huge gales during the night, kicking up these storms. Same thing here. They were struggling, it says, against the wind, so I think, and that's just part of our fallen human nature, is to just internalize the struggle too much, and that struggle just like feeds that flesh that wants to forget the promises of God and the promises of salvation through Christ. So I think the thing for me is, like, when we face struggles, when we face trials, don't let them overwhelm us. Take time to step away and focus on the promise and focus on Christ.
Absolutely, because I think this is a great example for us as Christians. We go through trials just like the disciples did. Maybe we're not in a literal boat going against winds and all the storms like that, but we have very real storms in our own lives, trials and tribulations, persecution, all kinds of things as Christians that we have to battle against. And our flesh and our spirit are constantly at odds, where our spirit wants to trust in the promises of God, and our flesh wants us to be afraid and to react negatively toward the disappointments of life and the trials and the storms of life, as you pointed out. And I think it's getting to the point where as Christians we're allowing our spirit to be in the right place and not choosing the flesh temptations of being afraid of the storms of life and losing heart when storms hit us and forgetting the things we've learned. Because I think that, as you pointed out earlier, that's really a key part of this, is they forgot what they already should have known about Jesus. They had been with him for some time. They'd seen amazing miracles, and they kind of just throw it all out when a storm hits them. And as you pointed out, this isn't the first storm in Mark that we see them go through, and it's not the first time they negatively respond to the trials of life. And for us, that's the same way as Christians. We've gone through trials many times as Christians, and yet we still, each time we're faced with a trial, we still have that temptation to give in to fear, to internalize the problems, and to not take them before Jesus in an appropriate way. So how can we, knowing all of that, how can we do better? How can we approach the storms with confidence in Jesus as opposed to being afraid of the storms?
I think it comes down to spiritual discipline and using the means of grace that we have, in being faithful to that and being regimented and disciplined to that. And I don't want to sound like too worksy here, because we know that we are justified by faith, not by works, lest any man should boast. Yet our faith should produce a desire in us to seek those means of grace that are giving us, like scripture reading, like prayer, like gathering with the saints, like hearing the word preached. And if we get in the rhythm of doing that in good seasons, right, when those trials hit us, we still have that. I don't want to say muscle memory, but you're still in that regimen. It's similar to like a soldier going off to basic training. They just drill those guys, combat drills over and over and over. And no matter how intense you try and make the drill, the back of that person's mind knows this isn't real combat. But the reason you do that is so when you get in real combat, when you get in a real trial, you just do that, and that's what saves your life. I think similarly with our spiritual lives, if we get in a habit of using those means of grace, staying in the Word, staying faithful to prayer, family worship, corporate worship, when those trials hit us, hopefully we at least stick to the vast majority of that, and that's what will get us through the trials.
Absolutely. So it's having that proper training, if you will, so that we're ready for the trials. And I think what you say is so important for Christians. We need to develop those good habits, make sure we're reading our scripture, really studying it, memorizing it if we can, seeking the Lord through prayer, and praising Him, developing worship. Like you said, it takes doing that in our homes, with our families, in corporate settings. There's a lot of different components of it, but if we prepare for the storms and trials of life, then we're going to be able to stand, and we're going to be able to get through them. So it's important for us to really take it seriously on the front side, to be prepared for the battles ahead and the storms ahead. Well, we hope you've been challenged by this and that you'll join us as we continue to talk about Lakeside Reflections here at Heavenward Thinking.